Hello and welcome back to IndustryBroadcast.com for audio article number 89. Today's audio article was written by JesperJuul, who is one of the most well-respected minds in the field of video games and has been deeply involved in the intellectual study of the art of games since 1998, when his first article was published in the literary magazine Critic, Volume 135. Since then, Jesper has written in books, published his own, given countless presentations and keynote addresses, and finished his PhD dissertation, Half Real: Video Games Between Real Rules and Fictional Worlds, which he successfully defended 4 months later. Currently, Mr. Juul is a video game lecturer and researcher at the Singapore MIT Gambit Game Labs, as well as owning Soup Games, which focuses on developing web-based multiplayer games and chat systems. To inject your day with more insight from this visionary mind, we can't recommend enough that you keep an eye on Jesper's blog, found at www.jesperjuul.net/ludologist, as well as checking out soupgames.net to see what fun indie project he's working on. Audio article number 89, titled Fear of Failing: The Many Meanings of Difficulty in Video Games, written by Jesper Juul and read aloud by Ryan Wienko on this beautiful 22nd of March, 2009. Winning isn't everything. It's quite simple. When you play a game, you want to win. Winning makes you happy, losing makes you unhappy. If this seems self-evident, there is nonetheless a contradictory viewpoint, according to which video games should neither be too easy nor too hard, implying that players also do not want to win, at least part of the time. This is a contradiction I will try to resolve in what follows. The question is, what is the role of failure in video games? The simplest theory of failure states that failing serves as a contrast to winning, that failure thereby makes winning all that much more enjoyable. There is, however, much more to failure. The study of players discussed in this essay indicates that failure serves the deeper function of making players readjust their perception of a game. In effect, failure adds content by making the player see new nuances in a game. The study shows that players have quite elaborate theories of failing as a source of enjoyment in games, and even so, given the negative connotations of failing, would a game be received better if players did not feel responsible for failing, but rather blamed failures on the game or on bad luck? This leads us to the second question. Do players prefer games where they do not feel responsible for failing? This study strongly indicates that this is not the case. Players clearly prefer feeling responsible for failing in a game. Not feeling responsible is tied to a negative perception of a game. In effect, this sharpens the contradiction between players as wanting to win and players wanting games to be challenging. Failing and feeling responsible for failing makes players enjoy a game more, not less. Closer examination reveals that the apparent contradiction originates from two separate perspectives on games: a goal-oriented perspective, wherein players want to win, and an aesthetic perspective, wherein players prefer games with the right amount of challenge and variation. Nevertheless, these two perspectives still present opposing considerations. The goal-oriented perspective suggests that games should be as easy as possible. The aesthetic perspective suggests that games should not be too easy. To examine this, I will take a closer look at the role of failure and punishment. I am writing here mainly about single-player games. Failure and punishment. Failure can be described as being unsuccessful at some task in a game, and punishment is what happens to the player as a result. We can distinguish between different types of punishment for player failure. Energy punishment, loss of energy, bringing the player closer to life punishment. Life punishment, loss of a life or a retry, bringing the player closer to game termination. Game termination punishment, game over. Setback punishment, having to replay part of the game or losing abilities. Losing energy brings the player closer to losing a life, and losing a life often leads to some type of setback. In this perspective, all failure eventually translates into setbacks, and the player's use of time and energy is the most fundamental currency in games. Whereas early video games in the arcade or on the home consoles or for personal computers tended to force the player to replay the entire game after failing. Many home games from the mid-1980s and on became much more lenient by dispersing save points, allowing the player to save the game at will, or letting the player restart at the latest level played even after a game over. As a recent example, after reaching game over in Super Mario Galaxy, the player loses coins and collectibles, but not overall progress of the game. In the new area of downloadable casual games, there is a movement from life punishment to energy punishment, with many games featuring energy bars, timers, and other types of soft evaluations of players' performance, as with the timer in Big City Adventures San Francisco. The psychological attribution theory provides a framework for examining different types of failure and punishment in games. According to attribution theory, for any event, people tend to attribute that event to certain causes. Harold K. Kelly distinguishes between three types of attributions that people can make in an event involving a person and an entity. Person: the event was caused by personal traits such as skill or disposition. Entity: the event was caused by characteristics of the entity. Circumstances: the event was based on transient causes such as luck, chance, and/or extraordinary effort from the person. In the case of receiving a low grade for a school test, a person may decide that this was due to A, the personal disposition such as lack of skill, B, the entity, it was an unfair test, or C, circumstances, having slept badly, having not studied enough. This maps out well to many common explanations in video games. A player who loses a game can claim that I am terrible at video games, this is an unfair game, or that I will win next time. During the research for this essay, I developed the hypothesis that energy punishment is being more widely used because it makes the cause of failure less obvious. If the game is over due to a single identifiable mistake, it is straightforward for the player to attribute failure to his or her own personal skill and performance, circumstance, or the person. But if the game is over due to an accumulation of small mistakes, the player is less likely to feel responsible for failing, and the player should be less likely to experience failing as an emotionally negative event. This is the second question mentioned in the introduction. Do players prefer feeling less responsible for failing? Video game theory through game prototypes. To elaborate this discussion, a game prototype study was conducted. This is not without precedent. In a study made over 25 years ago, Thomas W. Malone explored the question, why are computer games so captivating? By creating a number of game prototypes with the same core game, but with different features: music, scorekeeping, fantasy, types of feedback, etc. In order to explore the attraction of the variations of the game, he let some children play these prototypes and examine how long each prototype was able to keep the attention of the young players. From this, he deducted a number of guidelines for developing games and interfaces. Following Malone, the question in this essay can be approached as empirical questions. What do players prefer? They can, however, be approached from an aesthetic question point of view. What is a good game? These are two historically separate approaches that I nevertheless believe can inform each other in the following. In collaboration with game company GameLab, I developed a game prototype specifically designed to gather data on how players perceive failure. The custom game could be described as a combination of Pac-Man and Snake. Using the mouse, the player controls a snake that grows as the player collects pills. The player must avoid opponents, and a special power pill allows the player to attack opponents for a short while. The game was designed with two game modes: an energy punishment mode where the player would lose a tail part when hit by opponents, and a life punishment mode where the player could only make a single mistake before losing a life. In both games, the player has 3 lives, and the game consists of 4 levels. We attempted to balance the two games so that they were equally hard, as measured in the number of levels the players would complete. Another reason for developing a new game was that this would give insight to the player's initial experience of learning a new game, and be a less reflection of their previous experience with that game. First test, offline. A primary test was conducted offline. 5 males and 4 females from GameLab's tester base participated. All participants had some experience with and interest in games and came to the GameLab offices. Players were asked how they would rate the game had they found it on the internet. The rating scale went from 1 to 10, with 10 being the best rating, obviously. Additionally, players were asked to open questions about their views on failure in games. Contrary to expectation, this small sample gave no indication that players preferred the energy punishment version of the game. On the other hand, there were indications that the players' ratings were closely tied to their performance in the game, such that a player performing badly would dislike the game, and a player performing fairly well would like the game more. But a player performing very well would also dislike the game. Given the interesting applications of this result, it was decided to focus on only one version of the game, energy punishment, and run a new test online with a bigger sample. Second test, online. 85 players were recruited online and asked to play the game and answer the questionnaire. The players recruited were overwhelmingly male, 73 out of 85, and the majority had a game console in their home, also 73 out of 85. Players were generally avid game players. Game rating versus performance. Based on automated registration of player performances, player responses were placed into 3 categories, from a bad performance to a good performance. Players that did not complete the game, players that completed the game losing some lives, and players that completed the game without losing any lives. By comparing the average game rating with the performance of the players, we can see that the indication is that winning isn't everything. The most positive players were the ones that failed some, and then completed the game. Completing the game without failure was followed by a lower rating of the game. This runs counter to the simple idea that players enjoy a game more the better they do, but it vindicates that game design imperative that a game must be neither too hard nor too easy, as argued by, for example, Fullerton, Swain, and Hoffman in 2004. This returns us to the second question, of whether feeling responsible for a failure in a game will make players like the game less. In the test, players were asked why they failed or succeeded. Categories were based on attribution theory, but expanded into smaller subcategories. Person was split into I am bad at this kind of game and I am bad at games in general, to capture the difference between general player skills and player knowledge of specific genres. Entity was asked as the game was too hard, and circumstances was split into I was unlucky, I had made a mistake, in order to distinguish between the experiences of losing due to chance and losing due to a strategic mistake. Players were slightly more likely to report being responsible for success than being responsible for failure. This well-known phenomenon called attribution asymmetry, whereby individuals are more likely to attribute success to personal factors and failure to external ones. Do players prefer games where they do not feel responsible for failing? This seems not to be the case. On the contrary, even though players, presumably on some level, dislike being personally responsible for failing, the feeling of being responsible for failing was nevertheless tied to a positive rating of the game. Since players who never lost a life are not relevant, and too few players answered I was unlucky or I am bad at this kind of game for results to be meaningful, we can see how players who answered the game was too hard rated the game compared to those who answered I made a mistake. In this case, there is a clear significance. In effect, this answers the second question of this paper. Players prefer feeling responsible for their own failure, or at least the negative emotions of failing are more than cancelled out by other factors. This result is parallel to a study of players playing the bowling minigame in Super Monkey Ball 2, in which players exhibited positive reactions when falling off the edge of the playing field, but negative reactions of watching the replay of the same event. Although players do not want to fail, they nevertheless enjoy it when feeling responsible for it. Player reactions when not failing. Do players have theories of the function of failing, and in that case, how do they frame them? To find out, players were asked if they had ever experienced a game that was too easy, and how do you know if a game is too easy? Answers were sorted into 4 categories based on their primary content, listed here with example answers and percentages. Answer type: too easy as a lack of a challenge, 36%. Examples not challenging enough, boring, doesn't provide further challenges. If I don't feel challenged, of course that's a pretty predictable answer, but it's hard to put it any other way, or I got bored. Too easy as not failing, 6%. When you never die and beat it in a day, it doesn't seem to challenge me, I never lose. Too easy as not being measured on performance. I can do things I know are wrong and don't get punished. A game is too easy when you are progressing through the game automatically no matter how good you are playing. Too easy as not having to rethink strategy, 27%. When I know exactly what to do and I can do it, optimizing the results without a big effort. No challenge, going through the motions to complete it without any thought. If the challenge and the thought required to complete the objectives become second nature quickly, and there is no need for such contemplation. If the method for solving it is obvious and never fails. The first response type, lack of challenge, is somewhat tautological. Response 4 gives room for more interpretation. If a game being too easy is experienced as a game being shallow and uninteresting, it means that the role of failure is much more than the contrast to winning. Failure pushes players into reconsidering strategy, and failure thereby subjectively adds content to the game. The game appears deeper when the player fails. Failure makes the game more strategic. It would be nice to know if the results from this experiment map to players of published commercial games. In a discussion of the initial disappointing reception of the game Shop Mania, Catherine Herdlick and Eric Zimmerman discuss how much of the criticism of the game came from the fact that it was perceived as being too easy. In the original version of Shop Mania, we approached the first several levels of the game as a gradual tutorial that introduced the player to the basic game elements and the core of gameplay. This approach was based on the generally held casual game wisdom that downloadable games should be very easy to play, and that the frustration of losing a level should be minimized. However, the problem with going too far in this direction is that the game ends up feeling like interactive music. You can play forever and not really lose, and the essential tension and challenge of a good game are lost. From our analyses, the players were telling us that the first 7 or 8 levels felt like a tutorial. By the 3rd or 4th level, we had playtesters exclaiming out loud, "I get this game, can I skip the tutorial?" One of the negative comments on Shop Mania was about having seen the whole game too early. The C here probably does not refer directly to concrete graphics or level layout, as much as it ties into some of the players' comments in my experiment. The player complains about the game not pressuring them, not threatening with failure. Again, while players may dislike failure, not failing can be as bad as never succeeding. Flow, the standard theory of failure and challenge. The standard psychological explanation for game failure and challenge is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's theory on flow, according to which the challenge of a given activity forms a narrow channel in which the player is in an attractive flow state. While flow theory does suggest that the player may oscillate between anxiety and boredom, it poses the banal problem that the standard illustration suggests, a smooth increase in difficulty over time. Noah Falstein has refined this to say that game difficulty should vary in waves. Sometimes a game should be a little easy, sometimes a little hard, and that irregularity is what leads to enjoyment. As irregular increases in difficulty make the player more likely to experience both failure and success. Conclusions. The contradictory desires of players. I initially discussed a contradiction between the observation that players want to win and the observation that players prefer games where they lose some and then win some. This leaves us with several opposing considerations indicated that games should both be easier and harder than they are. 1. The player does not want to fail, make the player feel sad or inadequate. 2. Failing makes players reconsider his or her strategy, which makes the game more interesting. 3. Winning provides gratification, and 4. Winning without failure leads to dissatisfaction. Points 1 and 3 suggest that games should be easy, whereas points 2 and 4 suggest that games should not be too easy. The actual relationship of game design and game playing is probably not as antagonistic as this seems. A more productive view is that games derive their interest from the interaction between these different considerations, and that the apparent contradiction comes from the fact that games can be viewed from 2 distinct frames of reference. Playing a game entails 1. A goal orientation as part of the activity, but a player also has, too, an outside view of the game that entails an aesthetic evaluation of game challenge. This is the source of the contradiction discussed in the introduction, between players wanting to win and players wanting not just to win. The second question was whether players would prefer not feeling responsible for failing, and whether the success of casual games consequently could be attributed to the fact that they tend to have energy punishment rather than life punishment, making failure seem less of a direct consequence of the player's actions. This idea seems to be largely disproved. Player appreciation of the game was tied positively to feeling responsible to failure. This suggests that I had been focusing on the wrong part of the punishment system, and that the attraction of casual games is better explained as sparing use of setback punishment. Failing in casual games is rarely tied to any substantial setback, and never having to mechanically replay a game sequence. Players still feel responsible for failing, but they are less likely to feel stuck in a game, being forced to replay a part of the game. Finally, this research points to another layer of complexity in player psychology, that failure and difficulty is important to the enjoyment of a game, and it correlates well with Michael J. Apner's reversal theory, according to which people seek low arousal in normal goal-directed activities such as work, but high arousal, and hence challenge and danger, in activities performed for their intrinsic enjoyment, such as games. This yields an extra complication in relation to the game Shopmania discussed previously. If the role of failure is to force players to discover new strategies in a game, why is this even necessary? Given that players enjoy a challenge, why do players not simply challenge themselves by finding new ways to play the game? Game designer David Jaffe goes as far as asserting that players are basically lazy and will not use any mechanic they do not need to. They will take the path of least resistance to get from point A to point B, put simply. The conclusion must still be that players want to fail as well as win, but that players of the single-player games discussed here do not seek out additional challenges or depth if they do not have to. Perhaps single-player games are perceived as designed experiences that players expect to be correctly balanced without having to seek additional challenges themselves. By contrast, although the focus here has been on single-player games, Jonas Hyde-Smith has documented how players of multiplayer games frequently handicap themselves to create an even playing field, effectively opening themselves to failure. Multiplayer games and more open sandbox games seem to encourage to undertake more challenge-seeking behavior. This study raises a number of additional questions, but I believe the following are the most obvious ones to explore further. Is the relation between game rating and performance also consistent if the game is made easier or harder? How do players perceive difficulty in games without time pressures or failure states, such as endless mode in Bejeweled 2 or Sudoku? In game development experience, is it certain that small changes to game designs do matter to players? To what extent can individual elements of a game design be isolated? To what extent can we extrapolate from one game to all games? And finally, will the results of the test be different with more casual audiences? I have argued that failure is central to player enjoyment of games. This is not surprising, given conventional wisdom that a game should be balanced to match the skills of the player. However, it is notable that failure is more than a simple contrast to winning. Rather, failure is central to the experience of depth in the game, to the experience of improving skills. The study supports the idea that growth, the experience of learning, of adjusting strategies, of trying something new, is a core attraction of video games. Hence the desire for game balance. Losing some, winning some, is also a desire for variation in the challenge and difficulty of the game. Simply put, failure adds content. If the classic tenet of storytelling is Aristotle's, that the story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, the core tenet of games must be, a game should neither be too easy nor too hard. This is more than the simple truism it sounds like. It reveals much deeper and more complicated facts about games, as well as the people who play them. This concludes audio article number 89, once again written by Jesper Juul, whose blog can be found at jesperjuul.net/ludologist. As we've done so many times before, we once again recommend that you check back frequently with IndustryBroadcast.com, as we do our very best to update the site on a regular basis, bringing the collective insight of the gaming industry to your ears.